Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to wherever you may be joining us in the world today. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm Senior Technology Editor at the Journal of Commerce, and I want to say thank you on behalf of Ocean Insights and Shipping and Freight Resource for being here today for our webinar, 4 Executives Look into the Future of Global Supply Chains. COVID-19 has obviously been an unprecedented event for all of us. And for many of us, this might well be the defining moment of our logistics careers. 42% of the more than 300 logistics pros that were surveyed said they expect their companies to make substantive changes to their supply chains in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. 67% said they will be investing in technology as a result of the pandemic. 54% said they were somewhat prepared, 35% said they were not well prepared at all, and 7% said they were completely unprepared. I hope that 7% is dialing in today. Steve, maybe let's start with a question for you. What are some of those challenges that come about when it comes to implementing technology? And have any of those challenges eased now compared to software that was available, say, a decade ago?
Since 10 years ago, it's definitely helped mindless processes, I should say. We use technology to grab data that we used to have people go through constantly, and it really helps save time and money when it comes down to that, especially when you're dealing at such a large scale on our export side like we do. But if you're a bigger company, the other thing you have to figure out is, is it going to replace a lot of my human capital, and how easy is that to fix if something were to go wrong with the technology? And I really think that a lot of problem today is you have a more experienced older generation and a very young, bright tech generation that sometimes don't see eye to eye. And if there's a way that people can bridge that gap between the experience and the problem solving, I think we can move technology a lot faster to solve a lot more problems.
Really interesting. So we'll obviously circle back, Steve, in a sec. Pritam, I wanted to discuss with you kind of another thorny issue when we look at the issue of technology. So global logistics is inherently a multi-party challenge. And for some of the amazing, for some of the amazing technologies that are in the market, to be fully leveraged, you need to be able to share data among these parties. We hear this talked about all the time. What are some of the challenges that you see in your current role, but also calling back to your time as an operator in terms of data sharing? So
I think that's a very important point, because even as an operator, right? I mean, whenever you have tried to bring in a large number of players, and you have in logistics ecosystem, you always have these large number of partners, many of whom will have trust issues, in terms of what data they can share with you. As we drive this kind of data-driven ecosystems, that trust issue will be one of the core factors. And then you have to ask yourself, who solves that trust issue? In some cases, it might be the government trying to do the kind of the neutral party role and develop systems. So you have a great example in Singapore, for example, with the NTP that they're trying to drive in the Singaporean ecosystem, where the government is playing a major role. This is something that we'll have to get around, to what extent governments will have to play a role, to what extent large lead firms can drive the ecosystem on their own. It's something that we'll kind of have to keep our eyes open forward, especially since COVID-19 has made some of these systems almost essential in how we operate in the new kind of world that we have.
So Robin, you and I have talked about many times in the past about kind of the role that software providers play in the current ecosystem. And so you have an interesting view of kind of the utility of the data that you provide relative to other parties. And it's just a fact that shippers and forwarders that you work with, they sort of live in systems, right? They live in those other systems. So how do you kind of view the data and applications you provide relative to other systems that your customers may be using and relying upon? How should people think about investment in kind of ancillary systems like that?
Well, I think API is the buzzword of the day, and I think we have seen the advent of some very specialized data providers, very specialized solution providers. Like in the case of Ocean Insights, we do one thing only, and that's ocean visibility. And I think the situation has changed a little. It's viable for companies like Ocean Insights to offer a very specific service to a broad range of customers, and because of the easy connectivity of such service into third-party software systems. We used to call them the legacy systems because we understand every major companies running on SAP and Oracle, on I don't know, JDA, WiseTech, whatever. And a couple of years back, you had to offer the broad range, the full spectrum, a broad portfolio. But fortunately, new developments in technology allowed once again the advent of very specialized vendors, right? And that's, I think, a situation that many technology providers in the industry made use of, right? So that's the setup today, I think.
A couple of things to just dive a little bit deeper into. So, to what extent is the logistics industry able to create sort of organically developed standards through the use of commercial systems that everyone sort of congregates around, versus a independent kind of intergovernmental body that sets standards for the industry to adopt? Because it seems to me that because there's no IATA for container shipping, because there's no kind of formal body that everyone sort of rallies around, it's really hard to disseminate data standards and data sharing from top to bottom, right? And so should we think of data sharing and data standards as kind of something that bubbles up from just really effective commercial solutions? Pritam, I'll throw that your way first.
To a certain extent, that would work, right? I mean, in certain specific subsegments of logistics where you have, again, the whole trust issue, right? To what extent do the players in that system trust each other to drive that as a commercial exercise? Depends on which segment of logistics you're in. As you rightly pointed out, if I am in, in air cargo, it probably is easier to drive it through because there are long-standing institutions that are there. But in certain other segments of logistics, not so much.
Yeah, well, and we've seen, real commercially driven and neutral attempts in, the last year, really, to drive some of that stuff. And the other element I'll mention, and I'll sort of throw this to everybody, maybe Robin would be good to jump in on this. I feel like a lot of people in supply chain overvalue their proprietary information. They tend to put their arms around it and think that it's really something special and never to be shared. And it's and I think once people start to realize that their data is probably not as valuable to them as they think it is, and it's much more valuable to the network of people that they work with, then that changes mindsets. But it's a hard thing to overcome because a lot of times it's not something that person directly controls. They may have company controls. If they work for a large global multinational shipper, there may just be things that they can't change, right? So am I correct, do you think, in saying that most companies overvalue their information as it relates internally?
Well, I certainly agree. The context matters a lot. I feel that having data in confined in silos within companies often prevents such contextualization. So one company alone will not be able to make sense of their data because only sharing will allow them to get some context here. I think benchmarking is a good word. So we see that many of our customers and also companies who are not our customers frequently ask about benchmarking. So they want to know, how good am I? How much do I spend compared to the market? How fast am I compared to the market? The price for accessing such information is sharing data. So, well, yes, the data is not as valuable as they think in the situation they're confronted with, but it becomes more valuable once it's shared. That's our take at Ocean Insights.
Steve, any thoughts on this? Like, as an exporter, right? How did you think about the value of your data as it relates to the parties that you worked with? And now as a service provider, it must be integral to be able to access data of your customers and help themselves, basically, right?
To me, it always comes out to showing your own hand, right? In a poker game, nobody wants to give up their margins or their price. If you put out there that, some of the data that's sharing is what you're paying for ocean lanes or what you're paying for trucking, that really kind of makes you vulnerable to compete with other competitors based on service or certain technologies that they may or may not have. I think when it comes down to data sharing, some of it has to still remain private, because in our export industry, we don't want to give away who we're selling to, and we don't want to give away what our spot rates are and what we negotiated rates for. So I really think that data is great to be shared as far as predictability, maybe, or seeing lanes that are, anything that has a problem, what your options are. But if you're allowing people to see your prices and what you're making, then I think then it becomes a problem for your industry.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair, and I think where we get into like how data sharing can enhance efficiency, it's more about, I think, operational kind of data rather than anything around the procurement side of things, because things obviously get very dicey on that side of it for sure. So let me turn to another topic, automation, and I want to put this in the context of what everybody is facing right now, right? We're all working from home. We're all doing this call from home. Everybody is pretty much stuck at home working in a remote distributed fashion. I think one sort of overarching question is, how fully can we ever expect to automate kind of an end-to-end movement of physical goods? Steve, I'll start with you, and then maybe we can go around the horn on that one a little bit.
Automation that I think is pretty easy to implement would be any type of paper processes, anything that is repetitive, something you constantly do no matter what. That would be something clearly easy to automate. I think anything that you can do to not only ease your workload, but the workload of your customers. Simple automated emails of tracking or updates is crucial to a lot of businesses. The hard one would be stuff that requires government to step in. So we'll just pick on trucking industry. Currently, they're testing automation in states that don't have big weather patterns. Arizona is a prime testing ground, but it still don't have real world data for interacting with high volume traffic, snow, rain. Those are things that, at the end of the day, would you feel safe driving your car down the interstate and next to you is 80,000-pound semi that there's no driver in? It's anything could happen, but it's starting, and the cost of it may produce better outcomes. But the trucking industry is too a very huge market as far as employment goes, and you're going to get pushback from these guys that don't want to lose their jobs. They're scared of automation, and I think that's a big fear to a lot of people is, will I lose my job to a computer? And it's something to consider, definitely.
Yeah, Robin, you're providing data that a lot of companies try to collect in a very manual fashion on their own, right? So how do you sort of go through that process of, if it's not outright automation, how do you kind of discuss that with companies and who are worried about what their workforce looks like?
Well, I think no one's thinking of taking all the operators out of the equation, and this is not a future we are bracing for as Ocean Insights, at least not for the foreseeable future. But we think there is great value in prescriptions, right? So that's the layer above predictions. Make suggestions about operational alternatives. Here is a vessel delayed, what can you do, right? And we understand that that's a complex problem in itself, and it would require a deep integration with decision-making or operating software like SAP, Oracle, or whatever, just to name a few. But I would like to make a very simple example here. Together with one manufacturing company, we have built, some kind of virtual warehouse. In fact, they have built a virtual warehouse and we're providing data. Now, shipping used to be a bit of a black box for them. It was everybody's guess when a specific container is going to arrive. But they had a mechanism almost automatically where they triggered air freight shipments to supplement the warehouse once the warehouse inventory reached a certain threshold, right? And now we could artificially lower that threshold and saving them, some money. We could make recommendations as to when it's necessary to maybe call for air freight and when it's not. And I think it's not going to change the way you work overnight, but probably it's going to save you $1 million here, a couple of hundreds of thousands there, and it adds up. And no jobs were killed. It was just that the job of those people already working in that company was much easier.
Yeah, people talk about using technology to elevate people from their current roles to more kind of strategic value add roles. I do wonder if everyone who's in data entry right now, who might be replaced by some sort of automated process, is equipped to move into a strategic role or a value add role. Not everybody probably is. I think we're going to have to reckon as a logistics industry with new learning of skills and weighing who belongs in those heightened roles and who doesn't, and who maybe needs to look at another opportunity. Who in your organization really needs to be elevated, and who can be trained to be elevated. So Pritam, there's obviously a governmental, that we've been talking kind of about the private sector aspect of this. There's obviously a role that governments can play and are playing in terms of automation. What are you seeing kind of across the view that you have of who you work with in terms of where is automation as a priority for governments? Logistics automation, obviously.
Well, I think it's definitely a priority for governments, and this crisis has kind of made it even more acute. But I don't think the government per se has a role in driving automation in operations in logistics. What they have a role in is in automating the processes, and that I think what Steve was discussing is, from in a different perspective, that a lot of your operations require regulatory approvals at different stages, starting from customs or in different aspects of transport operations. A lot of paper moves through, which can be digitized. So I think there's a lot of that happening now because governments are genuinely concerned. You don't want to have face-to-face interfaces. You want to have much, risk management systems in place, which can on its own give you these approvals without human intervention. So a lot of the decision making can be automated using systems. So I think there's a lot of interest in that area. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happening across the world. In some parts of the world, it's already at a more advanced stage, if you look at Europe or North America. But it's going to happen even much more rapidly here in Asia and other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, really interesting. So we've actually gotten a few really interesting questions that have come in from the audience. So this is a really interesting one as it relates to COVID and the impact of COVID on kind of supply chain patterns. Do we expect global supply chains to be reshaped? Should we expect some production shift out of the factory of the world into more regional, local production locations as a way to minimize the risk of too heavy dependency on one country? Pritam, do you want to maybe start us off on that?
There are some very, extreme positions here. I don't think in the short to medium term we are going to see huge changes to the supply chain. The reason why certain factories are located in Vietnam, China, or other parts of the world in South America is for a good reason. There are very fundamental economic reasons why those production is located over there. I think much more than COVID, even last half a decade, we have seen new stuff coming. People are moving production around for different reasons. But I think you will see people not wanting to put all eggs in one basket. So if there's a huge concentration of a particular product that they source from one country or one factory, there will be attempts by large value chain operators to try to move away from that dependence. And so you will see some, in the medium term, some rejigging of the supply chain definitely, but not a radical transformation in the short term.
Yeah, anyone else? Steve?
The previous year we had the big tariff war, and I think there's a lot of companies that were already borderline considering moving to a different facility to get their materials, either finished product or raw materials, depending on what their business is. And with this happening, it does make you look at other areas where you can keep your business productive. Unfortunately, if you're a business that relies on raw materials and there's only certain part of the world that those raw materials are manufactured, then unfortunately that's going to be bad for you. But I do think people are considering their options, at least at this point. Even if something labor-wise and cost-wise, when it's landed, is cheaper to make out of Southeast Asia, And compared to, let's just say, Central America or Mexico, you may want to consider having a backup plan to have some of your products made in Mexico when stuff does happen like it did today. At least, you know, you can function on rail versus trying to catch a vessel that keeps getting blank sailed, or an area that's currently not working because they're shut down with COVID or whatever the case may be.
I can remember writing stories 10, 11 years ago about companies wanting to gravitate toward a China plus one or a China plus two strategy, right? So this has been on the radar of supply chain managers for a very long time, and it's not, the tariffs and COVID certainly were, you know, catalysts, I think, for accelerating plans along those lines, but people have been worried about resiliency. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs correctly if they weren't worried about resiliency and vulnerability to independent kind of sourcing locations. So we've seen obviously a exponential growth in e-commerce even prior to COVID. That has just gone through the roof during COVID, as we've obviously are a lot of times are not able to shop in store even if we wanted to. How does that trend sort of rebound into kind of what we consider like the traditional freight modes, air freight, ocean freight, you know, truckload? Are we going to see major shifts in volume away from large volume kind of modes into smaller volume modes, LTL, parcel, more air freight, that type of thing?
I guess I'll jump in on that. As far as the e-commerce goes, I believe that definitely went up because people didn't want to leave their homes and they're buying it. That's the thing there is, how much do prices increase when people are buying products that they hope are what they want, and then they find out it's not what I wanted and they send it back? Somebody has to pay that cost, and eventually it trickles down into the price of what your goods are. It'll be interesting to see for sure.
If I may jump in here, I think people tend to, you know, mistake how operations of e-commerce work, especially in the cross-border bit, but even if you have a large domestic market. A lot of the e-commerce actually comes in container loads. They come in container loads. They, you know, people know exactly what the consumption pattern is that part of the world is. They bring in large containers and they store it in the fulfillment centers, and it's fulfilled as the orders come. So you will have all different types of logistics supporting e-commerce, right? So the long haul will be in containers. Your last mile will be, you know, what you are, you know, whatever we are used to, somebody coming and dropping it at your door. And the cost will also be figured out and optimized, again, using all of the big data that we are discussing today. So I don't think e-commerce really radically changes the way we do different transport modes or we run our supply chains, but it does make a difference to the kind of business offerings each of these sub-segments will have to offer the customers that we have.
To piggyback off of what Pritam said was Amazon is, you know, they're taking a little different approach in my personal opinion. When it comes to having CDL and qualified drivers to transport your goods, there's a lot of criteria that comes into play. Clean driving record is one. Certain age is another. And what Amazon, I think, is currently doing, and this is just my opinion, if you notice, there's more and more of these econo vans that say Amazon Prime on there. And it's very easy to transport small goods without having a CDL driver or adhering to hours of service. And they're setting up a network of warehouses where even if they need a semi-driver, the new regulations with the FMC is that you can drive 150 air miles without having to run a full log. And that's crucial because guys can move to warehouse, you know, in big shipments and move that inventory where it needs to be, and then get it delivered at that last mile with these little vans with low qualified drivers. I mean, it's very easy to hire them versus, you know, finding someone with a CDL that has that.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's 3 of those vans outside my house right now. So maybe a couple more questions that have come in, really interesting questions from the audience. Maybe, Robin, I'll throw this to you. Near and dear to my heart is the impact of kind of a new wave of 3PLs. I'm always loath to use the word digital forwarder, but that's kind of, that moniker is kind of stuck. You know, all of them have kind of come in riding a wave of this idea that everything needs to be more digital, both front end and back end. What are some of the things that are kind of chronic gaps when it comes to existing paper-based processes and legacy systems that even these digital forwarders maybe haven't been able to address yet?
Well, I think it's not a big secret. Everyone knows that many of those e-freight forwarders have essentially replicated the operational structures of what can I call them, legacy freight forwarders. Well, most of the time I find that it's the customer experience that changed. And I had a chat with someone who's competing against Flexport, right? So he was working at the US West Coast, and he said, well, Flexport is all over the place. And you know what? He told me the only thing that they make different, the only differentiator is that they have the best looking reports. So I guess that's a little too, it's maybe oversimplified, but I think he had a point. So, those guys are offering apparently a great customer service, customer environments and user interfaces. And what they did, and somehow this appeals to customers, is simply sharing nice looking reports on performance, on transit times and such things. As far as I can tell, many of them have replicated, the structures as we know them. For the reason that also Pritam brought up. I mean, once you have to work with government agencies, there is no way you can just, find a workaround and destroy things and apologize later. It simply doesn't work. You have to pay your duties and such things, and therefore I think it's utterly difficult to really out innovate everyone. It's already very competitive.
Yeah, I think I kind of completely agree with what Robin was saying. You have to look at the work that we do, especially in the older aspects of industry like freight forwarding, right? There are certain aspects which require enormous amount of relationship building, right? You have to have that human interface. Somebody goes and takes care of the problem face to face, customs issues, or even dealing with unions. You have unions in different parts of the world that you have to negotiate with just to move your goods. And these kind of things, not only do you need to have the skills, you need to have developed relationships over the years. And these things you cannot automate or digitize, or so you will always need these people on the ground to move your goods. But there are of course many other things that you can digitize and automate. So you will never have a 100% digital freight forwarder. You will have a combination of the two. That's always going to be.
Yeah, really interesting thoughts. So let me maybe let's do one more question and really kind of drill back to what people can take away from this, especially in sort of a current and post-COVID environment. What skills do you guys think will be required sort of onwards from today in terms of supply chain management, in terms of people wanting ambitious in mind and ambitious in career goals in terms of moving up the chain in the logistics business?
I think you got to be adaptable when it comes down to it. Problems happen. Problems are going to continue to happen. It's really about how you react to it.
I would also like to mention that I think I find that some numeric skills maybe become more relevant. And we see this with our customers. We see that there's a broad range of different levels of proficiency when it comes to data science. And I'm not talking about being a full stack data scientist. That's not my point. But you have to know how to read this chart. How to make sense of certain data points. And I guess, this is something where many people in the industry could level up just a bit to really make the most out of great opportunities that digitalization offers, right? So that's I think something where I see some challenges ahead.
Great point. Pritam, you want to finish this off here?
With my years in industry, I think everybody who is working on operations does some form of optimization in their minds. I mean, this is one industry where you are just used to doing that. It's about taking that, about translating that into how technology can help. When Robin talks about reading charts, people make these mental reference charts in their minds anyway. They might not match the interface that they see digitally. It's about making that translation. And the firms which can do that successfully will be able to integrate their workers and drive productivity to the system. And the firms who don't do that so well will probably be laggards. So in some ways, it's a two-way problem. It's about the individual picking up the skills to be able to work with the technology that is changing, but it's also about large firms driving that change in the ecosystem as well.
Fantastic thoughts. Hopefully this has been a thought-provoking discussion for all of you who attended. I certainly learned a ton, and thank you all for attending so much, and have a great day.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.